a new vehicle. Let me correct that. Not a new one, a very used, new-to-me vehicle. When I went off to college, my dad helped me purchase. Anybody know what a Isuzu Trooper looks like? Anybody? It's like a giant tin box with wheels, right? And let me tell you, this car was very well used, very well used. But I loved that car. I loved it because I could fit my buddies in the car. It was big enough to basically haul everything I owned, because in college you move around a lot. I loved it because it was four-wheel drive. I'd never owned a four-wheel drive vehicle before. But let me tell you, this thing was well used. And I realized, I had a very distinct moment where I realized that vehicle wasn't working for me, and I needed something new. And it happened when I had a new job. I got my first job out of college, and I was putting in a late day, and I was the last one out of the building. And I walked out, and it was dark of night, except for a street lamp that kind of came down over my car. It was like out of a movie. And I went over to the vehicle, and this was before auto start or where you could open your doors. And I had to stick the key in the car, and I unlocked the door, and I grabbed the handle, and I opened the door, and that's when the door broke off the hinges and fell to the ground. I may have told that story before, but it's seared in my memory. And for me, it was this moment where I realized it wasn't working for me anymore. And I needed something new. A buddy of mine had a very similar experience. He drove a Chevette. Anybody remember the Chevette, right? It was a rust-colored Chevette, and it was a good thing it was rust-colored, because I don't know if it had more real rust or more rust paint on it. And this thing was just a piece of junk. I used to razz him all the time about this Chevette. He had a stereo in it that I think he had $1,000 in, though. The stereo was worth probably 3 times as much as the vehicle itself. Well, this buddy of mine was after the cutest girl in the grade ahead of us. And I remember telling him, I said, buddy, she is way out of your league. Just stop now. But prom was coming, and he actually got up the courage to ask her to prom. And I remember he came and told me, he said, you're not going to believe this. She said yes. And I remember saying, I don't believe you, right? But she said yes, and so he said, I'm going to do this right. And so he got his rusty old Chevette cleaned up. He put Armor All on the tires. He got new seat covers for the seats. He got one of those things you wrap over your steering wheel. He got fuzzy dice to hang in the window or in the mirror. He made, anyone remember mixtapes you'd make way back when? He made a mixtape for the drive to the restaurant and to prom. And he got her a corsage, he got a tux, right? And he was all set, ready to go. I think he even made reservations at Pizza Ranch, he was going all out, right? And you can't make this story up. He's on his way to Pizza Ranch or wherever he went with her, and he's got his stereo pumping, and he's got the fuzzy dice and all this, and this beautiful girl, that was way out of his league, was in the car with him. And he was turning a corner to head off to Pizza Ranch, and you're not going to believe this. The front passenger side tire broke off the axle. It totally broke off the axle. That'll ruin prom. But he knew at that moment that things weren't working for him with that car, and he was going to need something new. You see, folks, I think we have in our lives these moments where don't we realize that the things in our lives, every once in a while, they're just not working for us. And we need a new start, a new beginning. When I was a kid, my dad played church league softball, and he was so nice. He let me come along, and I always loved it because I got to sit with the guys on the bench and chew sunflower seeds and drink Gatorade. And every once in a while, my dad would get me some of that Big League Chew bubble gum. Anyone remember that stuff, right? And so I got to be with the men. And every once in a while, when they were way ahead or they were way behind, which was more often way behind, they would let me bat. And I was like knee-high at that time. And I remember like yesterday, I'd go up to bat, and they'd stick one of these big adult helmets on me, and I'd have this big old softball bat that felt like it was a tree trunk, right? And I'd get up to bat, and time again, this big bat was way too big, and I'd strike out every single time. And I got so mad because this would happen again and again and again. Even though my dad encouraged me, I just kept getting mad. And so I decided, I was a little kid, and this sounds ridiculous. I decided I just wasn't going to swing anymore. I was just going to stand there. So I got up to bat, and I just stood there. You know what happened? I got a walk. And so I decided that I was going to do that again and again and again. This was going to be my new strategy, right? A great strategy, huh? Of course, you can imagine how well that worked, right? And before long, it just wouldn't be working, right? That strategy wasn't going to work for a long time. I needed a new strategy. You see, folks, I think in life, we get to those points where there are things in our lives that just aren't working, and we need a new beginning. We need a new start. Maybe for you, I know it's been for me at times, there are relationships that just aren't working. I feel like I'm beating my head against the wall. All I want for that relationship is a new start, a new beginning. Maybe for you, it might be a living situation. You've lived in a house all your life, and you've got to a point where it's just not working anymore. Maybe it's the stairs or keeping up with the yard or whatever it is. It's just not working anymore. And you kind of get this idea that maybe it's time for a new beginning. Or maybe it's finances, huh? Maybe the way that you've been managing your finances, I know I've been there before, it's just not working. And you need a new start, a new beginning. We have these times in life where things just don't always work. And we need a new start. Maybe it's relationships with the people you most love, your kids or your parents. It's just not working, and you just pray that you can have a new start, a new beginning. Well, here's what I think. I think as I read the Bible, I think God knows exactly what we feel in those moments. Because I think God had moments in the Bible where God realized things aren't quite working. And God decided that God needed a new start, a new beginning. For example, the story of Moses. You might remember that story from Sunday school. God chose Moses to lead God's people out of slavery in Egypt and lead them to the promised land. And if you read the story, it actually, if you look at how God responded to God's people as they went through the wilderness, God actually got really angry at the people as they traveled through the wilderness. God led them through the Red Sea, and all the people did was bellyache. And we read that God got angry at them. What's this all about? They were hungry. They wanted food, and so God provided food, and all they did was grumble. God said, what's this all about? And God's anger, God actually got angry in the Bible. And it all culminated when God and Moses were up on Mount Sinai. And God looked down below, and God saw that the people had sort of rejected God. They'd said, we had enough of you, God. And so this is a crazy story, but they created this golden calf. And it said instead of worshiping God, they worshiped this golden calf. And God's anger he said, I've had enough. I've had enough of these people. They just don't get it. And it actually says in the Bible that God was going to wipe them all out. God said, I've just had enough. But what's interesting is in that story, God and Moses sort of have this bit of a conversation. And as they have this conversation, God starts to realize that these people are human like us, and they're not always perfect. And God stepped back during this conversation and realized that the way God was relating to God's people, it just wasn't working anymore. This heavy-handed approach, this sort of up in the sky, distant, judgmental sort of approach to God's people, God realized that wasn't going to work. And God chose a new beginning. And the story says, let's put the passage up on the screen. It says that the Lord changed his mind about the disaster that he had planned to bring on his people. You see, God stepped back, God saw how he was relating to his people, and God said, I need a new start. And the story says that God forgave God's people. God forgave them and renewed the promise God had and continued to lead them to the promised land. You see, we have a God who stepped back and saw this isn't working. And God needed a new beginning. It happens again in the story of Jonah. You remember Jonah and the whale? Nod your head so I know you're still awake. There we go. Jonah and the whale, right? God tells Jonah, go to Nineveh. And which way does Jonah go? The opposite direction. And that's when the whale scoops him up, spits him out on dry land, and Jonah wisely heads to Nineveh. And that's usually where we stop the story. But what's interesting is when he gets to Nineveh, he realizes that God is ticked at the Ninevites. He's so ticked at the Ninevites, he again says, I'm gonna wipe them all out. And that's when again God stepped back. And God said, this isn't working. This isn't how I want to be known. This isn't the kind of relationship I want with my people. And again, it said in Jonah, the book of Jonah, God changed his mind about the calamity that he had said he would bring upon them, and he did not do it. He forgave them. He stepped back, and he said, this isn't working. And what's interesting is the whole story of Jesus is really a story of God stepping back and looking over the way he had related to God's people in the story of the Old Testament and said, that way of relating to my people is this distant, far-off, judgmental, harsh sort of God. That's not who I want to be. That's not the relationship I want with my people. And so God sent Jesus, his own son, to be in a personal, intimate relationship with people like you and me. You see, the way God was relating to God's people, it just wasn't working. And so God chose a new way in Jesus. And what's interesting is that we find that, and again, in story after story, we have a God who's not afraid of recognizing that there are times in life where things don't work. And again, God has these new beginnings, these new starts. When I was in college, I had no idea when I went to college what I wanted to do with my life. Tell me I'm not the only one who was in that situation. Some of you are nodding and too afraid to raise your hand, huh? When I went to college, I had no idea. I started out actually as a music major, and that lasted for about 2 weeks. And I remember going, I love music, but I can't see myself in this career. And I remember talking to my parents, and they were just so patient with me. They were like, well, why don't you check other things? You like kids, so how about education? And so I switched to education. And my parents, I remember they were so patient. In fact, their patience would just grow as I went through college because I actually changed my major officially 7 different times. You name it, social work, philosophy, computer science, religion, business, I did it all, right? I think about this God of ours. This God isn't afraid to step back and say these things aren't working and offering a new beginning. You see, I think after Easter, God did this one more time. God stepped back and saw that things weren't working and started anew. I think God looked down on God's people after Easter, and Jesus had risen and ascended into heaven, and he saw these 12 disciples who were just doing their best to make a go of it. And I think God looked at them and said, you guys are great, but this isn't going to be enough. I need more. In order to get the story out to all the ends of the earth, this story of God's love and God's grace and God's mercy, I need a new start. We need a new beginning. We need something so much more. And I think that's when God created the church. The first story that we have after Jesus ascends into heaven is a story of the creation of the first church. And it's this really bizarre and wild story we're going to read tonight. It's called the Pentecost story. And it's this really bizarre story, but it's a story about how I believe God stepped back and God did something new. God created what we share together as a church. And we're going to read that today. It's in your bulletin if you'd like to follow along. It says, when the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together, all the disciples together in one place. And suddenly from heaven, there came a sound like the rush of a violent wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. Divided tongues as of fire, I said this is a bizarre, wild story, appeared among them, and a tongue rested on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages as the Spirit gave them ability. Now, there were devout Jews from every nation under heaven living in Jerusalem. And at this sound, the crowd gathers and was bewildered, because each one heard them speaking in the native language of each. Amazed and astonished, they asked, "Are not all these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear each of us in our own native language? Parthians, Medes, Elamites, and residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs. In our own language, we hear them speaking about God's deeds of power." All were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, "What does this mean?" And here's my favorite line. But others sneered and said, "They're filled with new wine." So I believe the story of the first church is a moment where God stepped back and saw things weren't working. I need to do something new. I'm going to start this thing called the church. And as that first church gathered together, there's one detail in this story I think the author went to painstaking detail to get across. It said that the people who gathered in that first church were people from where? From all around. All over the Middle East. They were from all around, and they were all gathered in one place. And the author goes on to say that gathered all together, these people who were likely at times enemies of one another, afraid of one another. They certainly have different traditions, different customs. They were from all these different places. They were gathered together in one place. And what did it say? It said they could understand one another. They connected with one another. They held things in common together. Somehow they were able to relate with one another. And I have this hunch that what bound them together as that first church wasn't so much the fact that there was something magical. I don't even think there was any necessarily a miracle that happened that day. You see, I think what bound all those people together had to do with the fact that I think likely they were all people who in life had stepped back and saw that things weren't working for them either, and that they needed a new beginning. Because I think about the people that Jesus hung out with. They were all people for whom they likely had rusty doors, they had wheels falling off in their life. There were people who step up to bat and they likely struck out again and again. You know the people Jesus hung out with. The woman at the well, crooked tax collectors, right? I think what bound them together is that they were a community of folks who realized that in this world sometimes things don't always go the way we plan. And that every last one of us needs a new beginning. And that's the kind of God we have, a God of new beginnings. Again and again and again, this God himself had new beginnings. And that's what the church is. It's a place where we gather together to get new beginnings, new starts, new hope. That Isuzu Trooper that I had, very next day I took it in and I traded it in, right? I kind of drove around the corner so they couldn't see it when I went into the dealer, right? I traded it in for a Subaru, don't judge me, right? And I took it to the cities a few months later, and I was at a stoplight, this brand new car. I was at a stoplight, and I smelled something burning. And I looked up, and you can't make this story up. There were flames coming out from under the hood of my brand new car. A mechanic had nicked the gas line. And I started a fire under the hood. There goes my brand new car, huh? You know, we're all going to need new beginnings in life, right? Maybe you've experienced one yourself. But that isn't the last new beginning, right? Again and again, as we gather as the church, as we just live as humans, we're people who step back, and every once in a while we recognize that things just aren't working for us, and we need a new start, we need a new beginning, and that's what the church is. It's a community of folks who gather together. When we're at our best, we gather together and we realize sometimes life just isn't working. And this is a place where we can just be, where we can be broken, where our doors can fall off and our wheels can fall off and we can strike out now and then. But we can gather together because we worship a God who's always there with one more new start, one more new beginning. It's a God who can do something new, brand new in your life and mine. Would you pray with me? God, as we gather together tonight, I know that in this room, there are all kinds of moments in the lives of those gathered here in my life where we've had to take a step back and we look at our life and we realize things aren't always working. God, you knew what that was like because in your life you did the same. You stepped back and there were moments where you recognized things aren't working. And you were never afraid of a new beginning, a new start, a new plan. And so God, remind us as we be the church here that this is a place where we can gather together, where we don't have to be perfect, where we can be broken from time to time. And you're always here offering us new life, new hope, a new way forward. God, I pray all this in the name of your Son, Jesus. And all God's people said, Amen.
This next one is kind of fun, so why don't we stand up?